Second, let's look at the burden of repeated sin. We have done a sin and we got forgiveness. Now what? You see, forgiveness is not the end point. Sinlessness is the end point. Forgiveness is a stop on the way to sinlessness. In the ideal world, we sin, we got corrected, and we'll never sin again. And we won't do the same sin again or similar sins again. But we all know that that's not how it happens. If you have kids, you tell your kids, did you brush your teeth in the morning? No. Okay, we've told you 10,000 times to brush your teeth before you come down. Or did you put the dishes away? No. And they just stand there. Okay, do you know what to do next? Okay, put the dishes away. So we have to tell the same things over and over and over, and we continue to repeat our old sins, our old tendencies, even the things that we know that we're not supposed to do. We deal with the issue of repeated sin. Even though we know the burden, even though we know the consequences, even though we know the pain of a sin, we continue to repeat a sin. Why? Why do we sin repeatedly? I want to give you 3 reasons why we sin repeatedly. We sin because we are wired to sin. We have temperamental weaknesses. Some people are more prone to anger. Some are more prone to lust. Some are more prone to laziness. Some are more prone to indiscipline, lack of self-control, fear, worry. And we are wired a certain way. And so we're not dealing with just sins. We are dealing with sin with a capital S. We are dealing with the sin nature. So in Psalm 51 verse 5 it reads, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." I'm not trying to give us an excuse to sin. We have no excuse to sin. Whether we have temperamental weaknesses or whether we are prone to sin, a certain sin or not, we have no excuse to sin. So none of this is an excuse to sin. God will still hold us culpable. Secondly, we sin repeatedly because it is wrong to sin. Romans chapter 7 verse 5, 7 and 8 reads, "For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions aroused by the law." Let me just stop there for a second. The sinful passions aroused by the law. Knowing the law raises sinful passions in us. And so you'll think, well, isn't the law sin? If law is stimulating sin, isn't the law sin? And so Paul says, what shall we say then in verse 7? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting, for apart from the law, sin was dead. I did not know what coveting was, but when I heard the command, "Do not covet," it produced in me every kind of coveting. I did not know what lust was, but when I heard the command, "Do not lust," or "Do not kill," or "Do not fear," that law produced in me the very thing it was trying not to produce. And that is why when we see a bench that says, "Fresh paint, do not touch," whether we touch it or not, the instinct is to touch it. So then that raises a huge problem, because how do we tell our kids to do or not do something? Because the moment you have told them to do or not do something, they want to do the exact opposite, just the same for us. When God tells us to do or not do something, we want to do exactly what we are told not to do. So knowing about sin doesn't rectify it. In fact, it makes it worse. The third reason why we sin repeatedly is because we want to sin. Sure, we ask forgiveness. Sure, we are contrite. Sure, we have remorse. Sure, we are sad that we displease God. But yet, deep down in our hearts, we want to sin. There is a dark side to sin. Turn your Bibles, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 25. This is the faith chapter talking about the heroes of the faith. And this particular context is talking about Moses. Look what it says in verse 25. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Did you catch that? Let me read it again. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. Sin is a pleasure. It is a fleeting pleasure, but it's a pleasure nonetheless. There is something alluring about sin. That's why, in spite of all the negative things about sin, we continue to sin because we are allured by the pleasure of sin. It is a pleasure to not forgive. It is a pleasure to lust. It is a pleasure to be angry. It is a pleasure to plan revenge. It is a pleasure to sin. And therefore we continue to sin. I'm not giving an excuse to sin. God will still hold us accountable. So Paul says in Romans chapter 7, verse 24, "What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death?" This is a reference to the Roman custom of punishment of a murderer. The Romans were experts at devising torture methods. What they did for a murderer is that they took the murdered body and chained it to the murderer. In those days, the murdered body's family didn't have any rights, I guess. But they chained it to the murderer, and he was free to go wherever he wanted. Nobody was supposed to help him, obviously. And in the eastern sun, the body would putrefy and turn disgusting and remind the murderer of what he had done. And so when Paul uses this, he's saying that we carry around this burden, this corpse that is connected to us. And so the psalmist pleads for inner permanent change. That's the only thing that can help us. So in Psalm chapter 51, verse 10, it reads, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." After Romans chapter 7 is Romans chapter 8, where it talks about the freedom of the Spirit that gives, that is able to set us free from this wretched body of death. It's the blood of Christ and the filling of the Spirit that will set us free from this body of death. Like the old hymn says, "Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil or victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood."